Section 17 of The Wright Brothers by Fred Kelly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. In Aviation Business. After companies to manufacture the Wright brothers' invention had been organized in France and Germany, and a plane had been sold in Italy, it might have been expected that important people in the United States would see commercial possibilities in the Wright patents. The inventors had indeed received offers. One proposal had come from two brothers in Detroit, influential stockholders in the Packard Automobile Company, Russell A. and Frederick M. Alger, who had some time before been the first in the United States to order a Wright machine for private use. But the first American company to manufacture the plane was promoted by a mere youngster. That was Clinton R. Peterkin. He was barely 24 and looked even younger. Only a year or two previously he had been with J.P. Morgan and Company as office boy, a job he had taken at the age of 15. But he had intelligently made the most of his opportunities by spending all the time he could in the firm's inner rooms, and had learned something of how new business enterprises were started. Now, recently returned from a stay in the West because of ill health, Peterkin wished to be a promoter, and he wondered if the Wright brothers would agree to the formation of a flying machine company. By chance, he learned that Wilbur Wright was spending a few days at the Park Avenue Hotel in New York, and in October 1909 he went to see him. Wilbur was approachable enough and received Peterkin in a friendly way, though he didn't seem to set too much store by the young man's proposals. In reply to questions, Wilbur said that he and his brother would not care to have a company formed unless those in it were men of consequence. They would want names that carried weight. Then Peterkin spoke of knowing J.P. Morgan, whom he might be able to interest. Without making any kind of agreement or promise, Wilbur told him he could go ahead and see what he could do, doubtless assuming that he would soon become discouraged. But Peterkin saw J.P. Morgan, who told him he would take stock, and that he would subscribe also for his friend Judge Elbert H. Gary, head of the United States Steel Corporation. After seeing Morgan, Peterkin was enthusiastically telling of his project to a distant relative of his, a member of a law firm with offices in the financial district. The senior partner in that law firm, Delancey Nichol, chanced to overhear what Peterkin was saying and grew interested. He suggested that perhaps he might be of help. That was a good piece of luck for Peterkin. He could hardly have found a better ally, for Delancey Nichol had an exceptionally wide and intimate acquaintance among men in the world of finance. All he needed to do to interest some of his friends was to call them on the telephone. In a surprisingly short time, an impressive list of moneyed men were enrolled as subscribers in the proposed flying machine company. A number of them were prominent in the field of transportation. The list included Cornelius Vanderbilt, August Belmont, Howard Gould, Theodore P. Shantz, Allen A. Ryan, Mortimer F. Plant, Andrew Friedman, and E. J. Berwind. Shantz was president of the New York Interborough Subway. Ryan, a son of Thomas F. Ryan, was a director of the Bethlehem Steel Corporation. Plant was chairman of the board of directors of the Southern Express Company and vice president of the Chicago, Indianapolis, and Louisville Railroad. Berwind, as president of the Berwind-White Coal Mining Company, had accumulated a great fortune from coal contracts with big steamship lines. Friedman had made his money originally as a sports promoter, and then in various financial operations. He later provided funds for founding the Andrew Friedman Home in New York. The Wrights wanted to have in their company their friends Robert J. Collier, president of Collier's Weekly, and the two Alger brothers of Detroit. Those names were promptly added. But the names of J.P. Morgan and E. H. Gary were not in the final list of stockholders. The truth was that some of the others in the proposed company did not want Morgan with them because they believed, probably correctly, that he would dominate the company, that where he sat would be the head of the table. One of them phoned to Morgan that the stock was oversubscribed. When he thus got strong hints that his participation was not too eagerly desired, Morgan promptly withdrew his offer to take stock for himself and Gary. On November 22, 1909, only about a month after Peterkin's first talk with Wilbur, the Wright Company was incorporated. The capital stock represented a paid-in value of $200,000. In payment for all rights to their patents in the United States, the Wright brothers received stock and cash, besides a provision for 10% royalty on all planes sold, and the Wright Company would thenceforth bear the expense of prosecuting all suits against patent infringers. From the Wright brothers' point of view, the one fly in the ointment was that they now found themselves more involved than ever in business affairs. It had been their dream to be entirely out of business and able to give their whole time to scientific research. The company opened impressive offices in the Night and Day Bank Building, 527 Fifth Avenue, New York, but the factory would be in Dayton. In January 1910, Frank Russell, a cousin of the Algers, who had been appointed factory manager, arrived in Dayton and went to see the Wrights at their office over the old bicycle shop. As the brothers had no desk space to offer him, they suggested a room at the rear of a plumbing shop down the street, where he might make temporary headquarters. According to Russell, Wilbur Wright came there a day or two later carrying a basket filled with letters directed to the Wright Company that had been accumulating. "I don't know what you'll want to do about these," Russell has reported Wilbur as jokingly saying. "Maybe they should be opened. But of course, if you open a letter, there's always the danger that you may decide to answer it, and then you're apt to find yourself involved in a long correspondence." At first, the Wright Company rented floor space in a factory building, but almost immediately the company started to build a modern factory of its own, and it was ready for use by November 1910. Within a short time after the company started operations in its rented space, it had a force of employees at mechanical work and was able to produce about 2 airplanes a month. The Wrights well knew that the time was not yet for the company to operate profitably by selling planes for private use. Their main opportunity to show a good return on the capital invested would be from public exhibitions. Relatively few people in the United States had yet seen an airplane in flight, and crowds would flock to behold this new miracle, still, in 1910, almost incredible. As soon as they decided to give public exhibitions, the Wrights got in touch with another pioneer of the air, Roy Knabenschue, a young man from Toledo, who had been making balloon flights since his early teens and was the first in the United States to have piloted a steerable balloon. They had previously become acquainted with Knabenschue. Because of his curiosity over anything pertaining to aerial navigation, he had once subscribed to a press clipping bureau which sent him anything found in the papers about aeronautics, and in this way he had been able to read an occasional news item about the 2 Dayton men said to have flown. With a fairly irresistible impish grin, Knabenschue never had much trouble making new acquaintances, and he decided to call upon the Wrights. This was before the Wright flights at Fort Myer and in France, and the brothers were not then interested when Knabenschue suggested that they sell him planes for exhibitions. "Well," he said, "I have been making airship flights at the big state fairs, besides promoting public exhibitions, and I know how to make the proper contacts. You may have heard about my flights in a small dirigible at the St. Louis World's Fair. If you ever decide to give exhibitions, just let me know." Though exhibitions had been farthest from the Wrights' thoughts at the time of that first meeting with Knabenschue, now the situation was different. Roy Knabenschue would probably be the very man they needed. They sent a telegram to him, and he received it at Los Angeles. He wired back that he would see them as soon as he returned to Ohio. This he did soon afterward. The result of their conversation was that Roy took charge of the work of arranging for public flights. He had need of a competent secretary, and an intelligent young woman, Miss Mabel Beck, came to take the job. This was her first employment, and she seemed a bit ill at ease, lest her work might not be satisfactory. But almost immediately she became an extraordinarily good assistant. So good, in fact, that Wilbur Wright afterward selected her to work with him in connection with suits against patent infringers, and after his death she became secretary to Orville Wright, in which position, at this writing, she still is. By the time Knabenschue had started planning for public exhibitions, Orville Wright had begun the training of pilots to handle the exhibition planes being built. The weather was still too wintry for flying at Huffman Field, now leased by the Wright Company, and it was necessary to find a suitable place in a warmer climate. The field selected was at Montgomery, Alabama. Today known as Maxwell Field, it is used by the United States government. Shortly after his arrival at Montgomery, early in 1910, Orville Wright had a new experience in the air. While at an altitude of about 1,500 feet, he found himself unable to descend, even though the machine was pointed downward as much as seemed safe. Brought up to have faith in the force of gravity, he didn't know at first what to make of this. For nearly 5 minutes he stayed there, in a puzzled state of mind bordering on alarm. Later it occurred to him that the machine must have been in a whirlwind of rising air current of unusual diameter, and that doubtless he could have returned quickly to Earth if he had first steered horizontally to get away from the rising current. The first pilot Orville trained was Walter Brookins of Dayton. Brookie was a logical candidate for that distinction, for since the age of 4 he had been a kind of pet of Orville's. After Orville had left Montgomery and returned to Dayton on May 8th, Brookins himself became an instructor. He began at Montgomery the training of Arch Hoxsey, noted for his personal charm and his gay, immaculate clothes, and also that of Spencer C. Crane. On his return to Dayton, Orville opened a flying school at the same Huffman Field the Wright brothers had used for their experiments in 1904-5. Here he trained A. L. Welsh and Duval LaChapelle. When Brookins arrived there from Montgomery near the end of May, he took on the training of Ralph Johnstone and Frank T. Coffin, besides completing the training of Hoxsey. 2 others trained at the same field later in the year were Phil O. Parmalee and C. O. Turpin. Orville Wright continued to make frequent flights until 1915, personally testing every new device used on a Wright plane. He did not make his final flight as a pilot until 1918. More than one person who witnessed flights at the Huffman Field, or at Sim Station, as the place was better known, has made comment that it was never difficult to pick Orville Wright from the other flyers, whether he was on the ground or in a plane. Students, and instructors too, would be dressed to the teeth for flying, with special suits, goggles, helmets, gauntlets, and so on. But Orville always wore an ordinary business suit. He might put on a pair of automobile goggles and shift his cap backward, and on cold days he would turn up his coat collar, but otherwise he was dressed as for the street. When he was in the air, anyone could recognize who it was from the smoothness of his flying. And when he wished to test the control and stability of a plane, he would sometimes come down and make figure eights at steep angles, with the wingtip maybe not more than a few feet from the grass. The public was no longer unaware of the significance of the flights at Huffman Field. Sightseers began to use every possible pretext to come as close to the planes as possible. One evening, as Orville Wright was standing near the hangar, a bystander edged up to him. "I flew with Orville Wright down at Montgomery," he declared, "and he told me to make myself at home here." Never before having seen Orville, he had mistaken him for an employee. 3 flights at Huffman Field in May 1910 were especially noteworthy. A short one by Wilbur, 1 minute 29 seconds, on May 21st, was the first he had made alone since his sensational feats starting from Governor's Island, and it was the last flight as a pilot Wilbur ever made. But on May 25th he and Orville flew for a short time together, with Orville piloting, the only occasion when the Wright brothers were both in the air at the same time. Later that same day, Orville took his father, Bishop Milton Wright, then 82 years old, for his first trip in a flying machine. They flew for 6 minutes 55 seconds, most of the time at about 350 feet. The only thing that Bishop Wright said while in the air was a request to go higher, higher. The average charge by the Wright Company for a series of exhibition flights at a county fair or elsewhere was about $5,000 for each plane used. At Indianapolis, the scene of the first exhibition, 5 planes were used. The weather was not ideal for the Indianapolis event, but the crowd was much impressed. Another early exhibition was at Atlantic City, where, for the first time, wheels were publicly used on a Wright machine for starting and landing. Roy Knabenschue knew from his experience in making public airship exhibitions that it was not enough to go where a fair or carnival was to be held and suggest airplane flights as a feature. To get all the business possible for his company, He must promote exhibition flights in places where no such big outdoor events were yet contemplated. He particularly desired to have flights made in large cities, where newspaper reports of the event would attract attention over a large area and aid him in making further bookings. With this in mind, he went to Chicago and started inquiries to learn whether public-spirited citizens there would be willing to underwrite a big public demonstration of aviation along the lakefront. Several people told him the man he should see was Harold McCormick, one of the controlling stockholders in the wealthy International Harvester Company. He went at once to McCormick's offices in the Harvester Building, but when he reached the outer office, he discovered that it was not easy to get any farther. "What was it you wished to see Mr. McCormick about?" asked the secretary. "I don't wish to sell him anything," Roy explained, smiling in a manner that should have won confidence, but didn't. "Please just say to him that there's a man here who has an important suggestion for him." "But if you'll tell me what the suggestion is," the secretary proposed, "then he can let you know if he is interested." "No, I'll tell you what you do," countered Roy. "Please hand my card to him and let him decide if he wishes to see me." The secretary reluctantly took Roy's card, which indicated that he represented the Wright Company of Dayton, Ohio. A moment later the secretary returned to say that Mr. McCormick was too busy to see anyone. Roy walked out of the building into Michigan Avenue, discouraged. No matter how good an idea you've got, he reflected, and no matter how much some of these big executives might be interested, you don't get a chance to tell them about it. As he strolled along, his eye chanced to fall on a big sign that read, "Think of it, the Record Herald, now 1 cent." Then he remembered that the Chicago Record Herald, rival of the Tribune in the morning field, had recently reduced its price and was making a big bid for increased circulation. He also recalled that H. Colsatt, owner of the Record Herald, had known his father. Using his father's name for an introduction, he had little difficulty a half hour later in gaining access to Colsatt's private office to tell him what was on his mind. The publisher grew interested. Yes, it might be a good idea to have some airplane flights along the lakefront and invite the public to see them as guests of the Record Herald. Before he left the office, Roy had the preliminary arrangements all made. On the opening day of the big event, when Walter Brookins, as pilot, was about to take off on the first flight, Knabenschue remarked to him, "That corner window on the 4th floor of the Harvester Building is in the office of a man I hope will see what's going on." The next day Knabenschue appeared once again at Harold McCormick's office in the Harvester Building and presented his business card to the same secretary he had met on his previous visit. After looking at the card, the secretary, without waiting to consult anyone, said, "Oh, yes, you're with the Wright Company. I'm sure Mr. McCormick will wish to see you. Just step this way." Roy had made this call partly as a kind of practical joke, for the satisfaction of entering an office where he had once been denied. But as a result of the talk he then had with McCormick, it was arranged that a committee of Chicago citizens should sponsor, the next year, another aviation meeting there, to be the biggest thing of the kind ever held. Meanwhile, on the final day of the 1910 exhibitions at Chicago, Brookins made the first long cross-country flight, 185 miles, to Springfield, Illinois. It was not, however, a non-stop flight. He made one landing in a cornfield, and it was necessary to obtain permission from the farm owner to cut a wide strip across the field to provide space for the plane to take off. In that same year, 1910, Dayton people saw the first flight over the city itself. Thousands had now seen flights at the Huffman Field, Sim Station, but no flight had ever been made nearer than 8 miles to the hometown where successful flying was conceived. The Greater Dayton Association was holding, in September, an industrial exhibit, but it was operating at a loss. Those in charge of the exhibit saw something would have to be done to arouse interest. Orville Wright was asked if he would start at Sim Station, fly to Dayton, and circle over the city. He agreed, and the newspapers announced the flight for the next day. It was stirring news, even to Catherine Wright. She had started to Oberlin to attend a college meeting, but when on her arrival there she happened to see a newspaper item about Orville's flight, scheduled for the next day, she hastened home at once. Another premier event in 1910 was when an airplane, for the first time in the world, was used for commercial express service. The Morehouse Martin Company, a department store in Columbus, Ohio, arranged to have a bolt of silk brought from the Huffman Field to a driving park beyond Columbus. The distance, of more than 60 miles, was covered at better than a mile a minute, then considered fast airplane speed, and the express fee was $5,000, or about $71.42 a pound. But within a day or two the store had a good profit on the transaction, for it sold small pieces of the silk for souvenirs, and the gross returns were more than $6,000. Then at Belmont Park, New York, in late October 1910, Wright planes participated in a great international aviation tournament. All other planes taking part were licensed by the Wright Company. Orville Wright now devoted his time mainly to supervision of engineering at the factory of the Wright Company. Wilbur was kept busy looking after the prosecution of suits against patent infringers, and in March 1911 he went to Europe in connection with suits brought by the Wright Company of France. From France he went to Germany, and while there called at the home of the widow of Otto Lilienthal, to offer his homage to the memory of that pioneer in aviation whose works had been an inspiration to the Wrights. After Wilbur's return to America, Orville spent several weeks in October 1911 at Kitty Hawk, where he went to do some experimenting with an automatic control device and to make soaring flights with a glider. In camp with him were Alec Ogilvy of England, who flew a Wright plane, Orville's brother Loren, and Loren's 10-year-old boy, Buster. On account of the presence of a group of newspapermen who appeared and were at the camp each day during his entire stay at Kitty Hawk, Orville never tested the new automatic device. But before his soaring experiments were over, he had made, on October 24th, a new record, soaring for 9 minutes 45 seconds. This was to remain the world's record until 10 years later, when it was exceeded in Germany. The same year, 1911, the Wright Company benefited from another aviation record. Cal P. Rogers, who had received some of his flying training at the Wright School, made, between September 11th and November 5th, the first transcontinental airplane trip from New York to California. New as their line of business was, the Wright Company was profitable from the start, especially so during the first year or two, when the sight of a flying machine was still a novelty, and contracts for exhibition flights were numerous. It might have been more profitable if the Wrights had not insisted that no contracts be made to include flights on Sunday. But inevitably the exhibition part of the business began to taper off, and such profits as might still have come from it were reduced by the persistent illegal competition of patent infringers. More and more, the company's dealings were with the United States Army and Navy, and with private buyers of planes. The first private plane sold had gone to Robert J. Collier, and others seeking the excitement or prestige of owning a plane had been making inquiries. The retail price of a plane was $5,000. With aviation thus becoming more practical, the Wrights were receiving from their invention a form of reward they had never expected. They would now have wealth, not vast, but enough to enable them to look forward to the time when they might retire and work happily together on scientific research. They were making plans, too, for their new home on a 17-acre wooded tract they had named Hawthorne Hill, in the Dayton suburb of Oakwood. But tragic days were ahead. Early in May, shortly after visiting the new home site with other members of the family, Wilbur was taken ill. What at first was assumed to be a minor indisposition proved to be typhoid fever. Worn out from worries over protecting, in patent litigation, the rights he knew were his and his brothers, he was not in condition to combat the disease. After an illness of 3 weeks, despite the best efforts of eminent specialists, early in the morning of Thursday, May 30th, 1912, Wilbur Wright died. He was aged only 45 years and 44 days. Messages of condolence and expressions of the world's loss poured in from 2 hemispheres, among them those from heads of governments. Orville Wright succeeded his brother as president of the Wright Company. In June 1913, Grover Loning, a young man who had become acquainted with Wilbur at the time of the Hudson-Fulton exhibition flights, came to the Wright Company as engineer and then became factory manager. Loaning had the distinction of being the first person in the United States to study aeronautical science in a university. Business affairs had been complicated earlier that year by the fact that Dayton had the worst flood in its history. The Wright factory was not underwater, but not many of the employees could reach the building. Among the hundreds of houses underwater was the Wright home on Hawthorne Street. To Orville, a serious part of the loss there was the damage to photographic negatives showing his and Wilbur's progress toward flight. But the negative of the famous picture of the first power flight was not much harmed. Accompanied by his sister, Orville made his last trip to Europe in 1913, on business relating to a patent suit in Germany. At about the same time, he sanctioned the forming of a Wright Company in England. Before Wilbur's death, there had been opportunities for a company in England, but the brothers had held back because all the offers appeared to be purely stock promotions, in which the names of the members of the English nobility would appear as sponsors. The British company, as finally organized, did not make planes itself, but issued licenses for use of the patents. Within a year after it was formed, the English company accepted from the British government a flat payment for all claims against the government for use of the Wright patents up to that time and during the remainder of the life of the basic patents. Though the amount paid was no trifling sum, the settlement was widely applauded by prominent Englishmen, among them Lord Northcliffe, as showing a generous attitude on the part of the patent owner. About as little as could have been compatible with full recognition of the priority of the Wright's invention. By this time, the Wright Company had more applications to train student pilots than they could handle. Even a few young women wished to become pilots. Two capable students of a somewhat earlier period, destined to go far in aviation, were Thomas D. Milling, later General Milling of the United States Army Air Corps, and Henry H. Arnold, who during the Second World War was Lieutenant General Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces and Deputy Chief of Staff for Air. One unfortunate student pilot, who had begun his training at the Wright School in 1912, later got himself into much trouble. This man became one of the best flyers in the United States. As he had plenty of money, he bought a plane of his own, and he used to give free exhibitions at his estate near Philadelphia. In one way or another, he did much for aviation, but in 1917, when the United States entered the First World War, that young pilot refused to register in the draft and became notorious as a draft evader. His name? Grover Cleveland Bergdahl. The early Wright plane he had bought is today on exhibition at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. It is believed to be the only authentic Model B, the first model built by the Wright Company, in existence. In 1914, Orville Wright had bought the stock of all other shareholders in the Wright Company, except that of his friend, Robert J. Collier, who, for sentimental reason, wished to retain his interest. Orville's motive in acquiring almost complete ownership of the company had been as a step toward getting entirely out of business. Both he and Wilbur Wright had agreed to stay with the company for a period of years, not yet expired, and he could not honorably dispose of his holdings so long as those with whom he had made the agreement were still in the company. But almost immediately after buying the shares of the others, he let it be known that he might be willing to sell his entire interest. To this, Collier, the only other shareholder, agreed. In 1915, Orville received an offer and gave an option to a small group of Eastern capitalists that included William Boyce Thompson and Frank Manville, the latter president of the Johns Manville Company. The deal was closed in October 1915. Just after Orville had given his option to the Eastern Syndicate, Robert J. Collier came to tell him an important piece of news, and to urge him not to sell just yet. Collier had been having some talks with his friend, the wealthy Harry Payne Whitney, and had urged upon him the idea of doing what Collier thought would be a wonderful piece of philanthropy that would mean much for the future of aviation in the United States. What Collier wanted him to do was to buy the stock of the Wright Company, thus gaining ownership of the Wright patents, and then immediately make the patents free to anyone in the United States who wished to manufacture airplanes. Whitney was willing to carry out the Collier suggestion. To do so, he was also ready to pay more for the stock of the Wright Company than the syndicate had offered. But Orville explained to Collier that the option already given was legally drawn, and the holders presumably wished to exercise it. Collier's daring idea and Whitney's generous acceptance of it had come just a little too late. End of section 17. Section 18 of The Wright Brothers by Fred Kelly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Patent Suits. The Wrights had found that patents covering the basic features of their invention were not enough protection against infringers. Indeed, having the technical details on file in the patent office, where anyone who desired might see them, was, in a way, to the advantage of those who would help themselves to an inventor's work and ideas. Only a decision in the courts could determine the justice of an inventor's claims. But the courts work slowly, and legal procedure is expensive. Except for their good fortune, never contemplated when they started, in realizing substantial sums from their invention, the brothers might not have been financially able to carry on the fight that finally gave them worldwide recognition as the first to contrive a successful flying machine. Altogether, the brothers had active part in a dozen different suits in the United States against infringers, and there were suits in France and Germany, in each of which about a dozen infringers were involved. Most of the suits in the United States did not go beyond the early stages, as the infringers were not disposed to continue after a preliminary injunction had been issued, but 3 suits were of special importance. One of these was against Louis Paulhan, French aviator, who was about to give exhibitions in the United States using planes made in France. Another was against Claude Graham White, English aviator, also about to give exhibitions in the United States with planes that infringed the Wright patents. The most important suit of all was against the Herring-Curtis Company and Glenn H. Curtis. This case was bitterly contested and was carried up to the U.S. Court of Appeals. It was brought by the Wright brothers late in 1909, but the Wright Company, formed shortly afterward, succeeded the brothers as complainants. Because of the importance of this suit in aviation history, it is worthwhile to examine the background of the relations between the Wrights and Glenn Curtis. The Wrights' personal acquaintance with Curtis began in May 1906, when he wrote to them in regard to the light motors of which he was a manufacturer. Then, in early September 1906, Curtis visited the Wright office and workshop. He was brought there by his friend, Captain Thomas S. Baldwin, a well-known aeronaut, who was giving exhibition flights in Dayton with his dirigible balloon, on which he used a motor he had persuaded Curtis to build for him. It was to make repairs on that motor that Curtis had come to Dayton. After that meeting, the 4 men, Curtis, Baldwin, and the Wrights, were together much of the time for several days. When in response to questions about their work, the Wrights showed a number of photographs of their flights made at the Huffman pasture during the 2 previous years, Curtis seemed much astonished. He remarked that it was the first time he had been able to believe anyone had actually been in the air with a flying machine. Long afterward, in an interview in the New York Times, February 28, 1914, Baldwin recalled the many talks he and Glenn Curtis had with the Wrights in that fall of 1906. "I sometimes suggested to Curtis," Baldwin told the interviewer, "that he was asking too many questions, but he kept right on. The Wrights had the frankness of schoolboys in it all, and had a rare confidence in us. I am sure Curtis at that time never thought of taking up flying." A year after the Wrights' first meeting with Curtis, in October 1907, the Aerial Experiment Association was formed by Alexander Graham Bell and others, with headquarters first in Nova Scotia and later at Hammondsport, New York, where Curtis lived. He became director of experiments. This was the first time Curtis had been directly connected with aviation except as a manufacturer of motors. And 3 months later, a letter he wrote to the Wrights indicated that motors, rather than aviation, were still his chief interest. "I just wish to keep in touch with you," he wrote, "and let you know that we have been making considerable progress in engine construction." After listing and describing the various engines he was building, he proposed to furnish to the Wrights, gratis, one of his 50-horsepower engines. but the offer was not accepted. The letter mentioned that Captain Baldwin was a permanent fixture in this establishment, a fact not without importance, considering information that Baldwin was later to reveal. Further on in the letter, Curtis told of Dr. Bell's reading to the members of the Aerial Experiment Association the United States government's specifications for the purchase of a flying machine, and added, "You, of course, are the only persons who could come anywhere near doing what is required." About a fortnight after receipt of that letter from Curtis, the Wrights got another letter, dated January 15, 1908, written on Aerial Experiment Association stationery, and signed by Lieutenant T. Selfridge, whose name appeared on the letterhead as secretary of the association. This was the same Selfridge who was killed a few months later in the tragic airplane accident at Fort Myer. In that letter, Selfridge, on behalf of the Experiment Association, said, "I am taking the liberty of writing you and asking your advice on certain points connected with gliding experiments, or rather glider construction, which we started here last Monday. Will you kindly tell me what results you obtained on the travel of the center of pressure, both on air curves and aeroplanes? Also, what is a good, efficient method of constructing the ribs of the surfaces so that they will be light and yet strong enough to maintain their curvature under ordinary conditions, and a good means of fastening them to the cloth and upper lateral cords of the frame? I hope I am not imposing too much by asking you these questions." Supposing the information would be used only for scientific purposes, the Wrights obligingly replied at once as follows: "You will find much of the information you desire in the addresses of our Mr. Wilbur Wright before the Western Society of Engineers, published in the Journals of the Society of December, 1901, and August, 1903. The travel of the center of pressure on airplanes is from the center at 90 degrees toward the front edge as the angle becomes smaller. The center of pressure on a curved surface is approximately at its center at 90 degrees, moves forward as the angle is decreased until a critical angle is reached, after which it reverses and moves toward the rear edge. The critical angle varies for different shaped curves, but is generally reached at some angle between 12 and 18 degrees. With the angles used in gliding flight, the travel will be between the center of the surface and a point 1/3 back from the front edge. The methods of construction used in our gliders are fully described in an article by Mr. Chanute in the Revue des Sciences in 1903. We do not remember the month, and in the specifications of our United States patent, number 821,393. The ribs of our gliders were made of second-growth ash, steamed and bent to shape. Selfridge replied in a few days, saying he had been able to obtain a copy of the patent and would endeavor to get the other references the Wrights had supplied. The data must have been useful to the Aerial Experiment Association, for early the following summer, Glenn Curtis, director of experiments, had a power-driven airplane called the June Bug, in which he made a flight on July 4, 1908, at Hammondsport. That flight created the belief in the minds of many who were not fully informed that the Aerial Experiment Association must have done an amazing job of original research. This belief was encouraged by the fact that after the Aerial Experiment Association began building and experimenting with flying machines, using much information they had obtained from the Wrights, they neglected in public statements about their work to so much as mention the Wright brothers. Soon after the report of the flight of the June Bug, there appeared in the press a statement that the Aerial Experiment Association was disbanding and that Glenn H. Curtis was going to engage in exhibition flying. That news led Orville Wright to send to Curtis the following letter: "I learned from the Scientific American that your June Bug has movable surfaces at the tips of the wings, adjustable to different angles on the right and left sides for maintaining the lateral balance. In our letter to Lieutenant Selfridge of January 18th, replying to his of the 15th, in which he asked for information on the construction of flyers, we referred him to several publications containing descriptions of the structural features of our machines, and to our U.S. patent number 821,393. We did not intend, of course, to give permission to use the patented features of our machine for exhibitions or in a commercial way. This patent broadly covers the combination of sustaining surfaces to the right and left of the center of a flying machine, adjustable to different angles, with vertical surfaces adjustable to correct inequalities in the horizontal resistances of the differently adjusted wings. Claim 14 of our patent, number 821,393, specifically covers the combination which we are informed you are using. We believe it will be very difficult to develop a successful machine without the use of some of the features covered in this patent. The commercial part of our business is taking so much of our time that we have not been able to undertake public exhibitions. If it is your desire to enter the exhibition business, we would be glad to take up the matter of a license to operate under our patents for that purpose. Curtis replied that, contrary to newspaper reports, he did not expect to do anything in the way of exhibitions, that his flights had been in connection with the Aerial Experiment Association's work. The matter of patents he had referred, he said, to the secretary of the association. A few weeks later, when Orville went to Washington in preparation for the Fort Myer tests of the Wright machine, Captain Baldwin was there teaching Army officers to operate a new dirigible balloon, for which Curtis had furnished the motor. In speaking of the experiments in aviation being carried on by Curtis and other members of the Aerial Experiment Association at Hammondsport, Baldwin said warningly to Orville, "I hear them talking." He went on to caution Orville that the work those men were doing would infringe the Wright patents. By the following year, Curtis had formed a commercial company, the Herring-Curtis Company, to make or exhibit airplanes. On January 3, 1910, Judge John R. Hazel of the Federal Circuit Court at Buffalo, New York, granted a temporary restraining order against the Herring-Curtis Company and Glenn H. Curtis to prevent them from infringement of the Wright patents. In handing down his decision, Judge Hazel said, "It appears that the defendant, Curtis, had notice of the success of the Wright machine, and that a patent had been issued in 1906. Indeed, no one interfered with the right of the patentees by constructing machines similar to theirs until in July 1908, when Curtis exhibited a flying machine which he called the June Bug. He was immediately notified by the patentees that such machine, with its movable surfaces at the tips, or wings, infringed the patent in suit, and he replied that he did not intend to publicly exhibit the machine for profit, but merely was engaged in exhibiting it for scientific purposes, as a member of the Aerial Experiment Association. To this the patentees did not object. Subsequently, however, the machine, with supplementary planes placed midway between the upper and lower airplanes, was publicly exhibited by the defendant corporation, and used by Curtis in aerial flights for prizes and emoluments. It further appears that the defendants now threaten to continue such use for gain and profit, and to engage in the manufacture and sale of such infringing machine, thereby becoming an active rival of the complainant in the business of constructing flying machines embodying the claims in suit. But such use of the infringing machine it is the duty of this court on the papers presented to enjoin. Then, in February 1910, Judge Learned Hand, in the Federal Circuit Court at New York, issued an injunction to prevent the French aviator, Louis Paulhan, from making exhibitions in the United States unless he would put up an indemnity to the amount of $25,000. The court declared that both the Blériot and Farman planes that the defendant was planning to use were infringements of the Wright patents. Not until January 13, 1914, did the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals hand down its decision in the Wright suit against Curtis. The decision was in favor of the Wright Company. In his interview in the New York Times, already quoted from, published in the New York Times February 28, 1914, Captain Thomas S. Baldwin, though a close associate of Curtis, heartily endorsed the final decision in the Wright v. Curtis case. Referring to that decision, he told the interviewer, "It is high time for all the rest of us to step up and admit that not a one of us ever would have got off the ground in flight if the Wrights had not unlocked the secret for us. I want to go on record as saying that the Wrights are fully entitled to the decision they have at last received." "Mr. Curtis is a friend of mine today," said Baldwin, "and I have served in his companies as a director. But it is due to the Wrights, as a simple matter of justice, to have the story of the actual genesis of flight fully established." By that time Captain Baldwin had abandoned the dirigible balloon for the airplane, and thus he too had been an infringer of the Wright patent. But as his public statements indicated, he showed an attitude quite different from that of most other infringers. Glenn Martin was another, like Baldwin, who acknowledged indebtedness to the Wrights. After the Wrights had won their important suit against Curtis in the Circuit Court of Appeals, Curtis made no secret of the fact that he still hoped to find a possible loophole to get around the Wright patent. Since the decision of the court enjoined him from using two ailerons operating simultaneously in opposite directions, he thought perhaps he could escape penalty by using just one aileron at a time while the other remained inoperative. This, however, was covered by Claim 1 of the Wright patent, if the claim were given a liberal interpretation, as the court had said the Wright patent was entitled to, on account of the Wrights being the pioneers in the art of flying. But Claim 1 had not been cited in the former suits, and so had not as yet been adjudicated. If Curtis could just show, or seem to show, in some way, that the Wrights were not exactly pioneers, that some other machine capable of flight antedated the Wright machine, then he would be in a stronger position to defend himself against Claim 1, if it should be cited against him. Anticipating a suit, Curtis took astounding means to prepare for combating it, as will appear. But after all the evidence was taken in that case, and just before the case was to come to trial, Orville Wright sold his interest in the Wright Company to New York capitalists. Curtis then contrived to gain delay after delay by approaching the new owners with proposals of settlement. These negotiations dragged on until the United States entered the First World War, and the Manufacturers Aircraft Association was organized for cross-licensing manufacturers who were building machines for the United States government. Through this cross-licensing agreement, the Wright Company received royalty on all planes manufactured for the government. Consequently, this last case against Curtis never came to trial. The Wrights won their patent suits, too, in the highest courts of both Germany and France. The court in Germany made the comment in its oral decision that their discovery that a rear rudder was a balancing device rather than a steering device should entitle them to a basic patent. Without going into too much detail about the various patent suits, the important point is that the priority of the Wright patents was sustained by the courts in both the United States and Europe. Every airplane that flies, in any part of the world, even today, does so by use of devices and discoveries first made by the Wright brothers. These patent suits were a terrible ordeal for the attorneys and judges concerned, for aviation was so new that many of the technical terms were beyond the knowledge of nearly everyone. It was as if lawyers and judges had to learn a new language and take a course in the theoretical side of aeronautical engineering as they went along. In a case against a foreign aviator, Wilbur Wright was called upon in court to explain the function and operation of a rudder when an airplane is making a circle. Wilbur got hold of a piece of string and a fragment of chalk and went to a blackboard, where he made it clear to the judge that when a machine is making a turn, the pressure is on the opposite side of an airplane rudder from what it is on a ship's or a dirigible's rudder when they are making the same turn. After the judge had issued a temporary restraining order at the end of the day's proceedings, Clarence J. Shearn, attorney for the defendant, gloomily remarked, "If it hadn't been for Wright and that damned piece of string, we would have won." One bit of testimony in another case was in regard to the accuracy of observations of men who fly airplanes. To show the inaccuracy of most people's observations on phenomena having to do with physical laws, Wilbur used for illustration what a man thinks happens when riding a bicycle. "I have asked dozens of bicycle riders," said Wilbur, "how they turn a bicycle to the left. I have never found a single person who stated all the facts correctly when first asked. They almost invariably said that, to turn to the left, they turned the handlebars to the left, and as a result made a turn to the left. but on further questioning them, some would agree that they first turned the handlebar a little to the right, and then, as the machine became inclined to the left, they turned the handlebar to the left and made the circle, inclining inwardly. To a scientific student it is very clear that without the preliminary movement of the handlebar to the right, a movement of the handlebar to the left would cause the bicycle to run out from under the man, who would continue headlong in his original direction. Yet I have found many people who would deny having ever noticed the preliminary movement of the handlebar to the right. I have never found a non-scientific bicycle rider who had particularly noticed it and spoke of it from his own conscious observation and initiative. I have found the same condition among aviators with whom I have flown. Some have almost no consciousness of whether the machine is rising a little or descending a little, or whether it is sliding somewhat to the right or to the left. The ability to notice these things, even in small degrees, is the main quality which distinguishes skilled aviators from novices, and born flyers from men who will never be able to handle flying machines competently. Even though the Wrights won all their patent suits, collecting royalties proved to be something else. End of section 18. Section 19 of The Wright Brothers by Fred Kelly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Why the Wright Plane Was Exiled. Part 1. Why was the original Wright airplane, the first flying machine in the world capable of flight, deposited in the Science Museum at South Kensington, London, England, rather than in the United States National Museum, administered by the Smithsonian Institution at Washington? Why should Exhibit A of one of the greatest of all American scientific achievements be in exile? For the answer to these questions, puzzling to a vast number of patriotic Americans, we must trace events back a number of years. It will be remembered that Dr. Samuel P. Langley, while director and secretary of the Smithsonian, with a $50,000 government fund at his disposal for experiments, besides $20,000 from the Hodgkins Fund, had failed in his attempts to build a successful man-carrying flying machine. At each trial in 1903, his machine promptly fell from its launching platform into the Potomac. Doubtless Langley's failure was a bitter disappointment to him, all the more so because he was derided in the public press for having even tried what was commonly believed to be impossible. But when the Wrights flew only 9 days after Langley's final unsuccessful trial, they, in a measure, saved the Langley reputation. No one could any longer say that he was a crank. The Wrights had vindicated his belief that man could fly. Langley uttered no word to minimize the importance of the Wrights' feat, nor was anything unfriendly toward Langley ever said by either of the Wrights. On the contrary, the Wrights more than once gave Langley credit for having been a source of inspiration to them, from the simple fact that he, an eminent scientist, considered human flight possible. Indeed, the Wrights took advantage of an opportunity to save the Langley name from being made ridiculous. After Dr. Langley's death, the Smithsonian Regents ordered the erection in the Smithsonian Building of a tablet in his memory. The plan was to inscribe on the tablet the Langley Law as Langley's chief contribution to aeronautical science. Dr. Charles D. Walcott, who succeeded Dr. Langley as secretary of the Smithsonian, sent the proposed inscription to the Wrights for their opinion of it. Wilbur Wright replied that it would be both unwise and unfair to Langley to rest his reputation in aerodynamics especially on that so-called Langley Law, or upon the computations which gave rise to it. The Wrights knew at that time, as all aeronautical engineers know today, that the Langley Law was simply a mistake and not true. Because of what Wilbur Wright pointed out in his letter, the Langley Law was omitted from the memorial tablet. But having eliminated the discredited law that was Langley's, Dr. Walcott then put in its place on the tablet an inscription crediting Langley for a discovery that was not his. The inscription claimed for Langley that he had discovered the relations of speed and angle of inclination to the lifting power of surfaces moving in the air. His table of air pressures had been antedated by both Duchemin and Lilienthal. This tendency to claim for Langley what was not his was destined to show itself in a more pernicious form in later acts of Dr. Walcott. If Langley had lived, the relations between the Smithsonian and the Wrights would doubtless have continued to be marked by mutual respect and consideration. But after Dr. Langley's death, the attitude of the Smithsonian began to change. The institution started a subtle campaign to belittle the Wrights, to try to take from them much of the credit for having both produced and demonstrated the first machine capable of flight, and for having done the original research that made the machine possible. Indeed, the institution even went so far as to issue false and misleading statements. One of these was in connection with the first award of a Langley Medal, publicly presented to the Wrights in February 1910. In referring to that presentation, the annual report for the year 1910, page 23, by the secretary of the institution, quoted Wilbur Wright as making a statement not made by him on that occasion at all, but used in a different connection at another time. The improper use of that quotation helped to create a false impression over the world that the Wrights had acknowledged indebtedness to Langley's scientific work. The truth was that Wilbur Wright had, in a private letter, mentioned indebtedness to Langley, not for scientific data, but for the fact that it was encouraging to know that the head of a scientific institution believed human flight to be possible. Langley's published work in the field of aerodynamics dealt with measurements of air pressures on flat surfaces only, and later experiments proved even that to be incorrect. The Smithsonian has more than once mentioned the award of the Langley Medal to the Wrights as proof of the institution's disposition to honor them. But the truth is that the Langley Medal was established to honor Langley, not the Wrights. Neither in the award nor in the presentation of the medal to the Wright brothers was there any suggestion that the Wrights were the first to fly. In 1910, Dr. Walcott made it evident that the institution actually did not want the original Wright plane of 1903 as an exhibit. This could be seen in letters he sent to Wilbur Wright in the spring of 1910. The first of these, dated March 7th, said, "The National Museum is endeavoring to enlarge its collections illustrating the progress of aviation, and, in this connection, it has been suggested that you might be willing to deposit one of your machines, or a model thereof, for exhibition purposes. The great public interest manifested in this science, and the numerous inquiries from visitors for the Wright machine, make it manifest that if one were placed on exhibition here, it would form one of the most interesting specimens in the national collections. It is sincerely hoped that you may find it possible to accede to this request." Wilbur Wright replied as follows: "My dear Dr. Walcott, if you will inform us just what your preference would be in the matter of a flyer for the National Museum, we will see what would be possible in the way of meeting your wishes. At present nothing is in condition for such use, but there are 3 possibilities. We might construct a small model showing the general construction of the aeroplane, but with a dummy power plant. Or we can reconstruct the 1903 machine, with which the first flights were made at Kitty Hawk. Most of the parts are still in existence. This machine would occupy a space 40 feet by 20 feet by 8 feet. Or a model showing the general design of the latter machine could be constructed." The peculiar attitude of the Smithsonian then began to appear. In his next letter to Wilbur Wright, dated April 11, 1910, Dr. Walcott wrote, "The matter of the representation of the Wright airplane has been very carefully considered by Mr. George C. Maynard, who has charge of the Division of Technology in the National Museum. I told him to indicate what he would like for the exhibit, in order that the matter might be placed clearly before you and your brother. In his report he says, 'The following objects illustrating the Wright inventions would make a very valuable addition to the aeronautical exhibits in the museum. 1. A quarter-size model of the airplane used by Orville Wright at Fort Myer, Virginia, in September 1908. Such a model, equipped with a dummy power plant, as suggested by the Wrights, would be quite suitable. 2. If there are any radical differences between the machine referred to and the one used at Kitty Hawk, a second model of the latter machine would be very appropriate. 3. A full-sized Wright aeroplane. Inasmuch as the machine used at Fort Myer has attracted such worldwide interest, that machine, if it can be repaired or reconstructed, would seem most suitable. If, however, the Wright brothers think the Kitty Hawk machine would answer the purpose better, their judgment might decide the question. 4. If the Wright brothers have an engine of an early type used by them, which could be placed in a floor case for close inspection, that will be desirable. The engine of the Langley Aerodrome is now on exhibition in a glass case, and the original full-size machine is soon to be hung in one of the large halls. The 3 Langley quarter-size models are on exhibition. The natural plan would be to install the different Wright machines along with the Langley machines, making the exhibit illustrate 2 very important steps in the history of the aeronautical art. The request of Mr. Maynard is rather a large one, but we will have to leave it to your discretion as to what you think is practicable for you to do. Sincerely yours, Charles D. Walcott, Secretary. If Dr. Walcott's suggestions that the Wright provide a reproduction in model size of their 1908 plane and the 1908 plane itself had been accepted, then the proposal exhibits in the National Museum of Models and Full-Size Machines by Langley and the Wrights could easily have been of a nature to give a wrong impression. Surely a good many uninformed visitors to the museum would hardly have known or stopped to think that it is one thing to build and fly a small model plane, but an altogether different problem to build and fly a plane of the same design large enough to carry a man. Small models of flying machines were flown by the Frenchman, Pénaud, as early as 1871, but a larger machine of the same design could not be flown, as the Wrights themselves in early boyhood had found out. Likewise, the fact that Langley flew a steam-driven model in 1896 and a gas-driven model in 1903 would not indicate to anyone who understands such matters that a full-size machine of the same design as either of the models could support itself in the air. Langley's own experiments had proved how great is the gap between success with a model and with a larger machine. His full-size machine of 1903, of the same design as the model flown earlier that year, collapsed the moment it was launched. But suppose an uninformed visitor noticed, side by side, a Langley model plane of 1903 and a reproduction, in model size, of the Wright machine flown with a pilot in 1908. If he hadn't read the labels carefully, or if the labels didn't go into enough detail to make the facts clear, couldn't he easily have received the false impression that Langley had been at least 5 years ahead of the Wrights? And if the visitor didn't know that the Langley full-size machine of 1903 never flew, wouldn't the sight of it, alongside the Wright machine flown in 1908, have seemed to confirm the wrong impression? Perhaps, however, that was the impression Dr. Walcott wanted museum visitors to receive. The Walcott letter said, it may be noted, that if there were any radical differences between the first Wright machine and the one flown in 1908, then a model of the first machine might be appropriate. But since there were no radical differences between the 1903 and 1908 machines, not even a small-sized model of the first machine ever to be flown was being asked for. The Wrights took the letter to mean that the Smithsonian did not want an exhibit that would emphasize the fact of their having flown a successful man-carrying machine as early as 1903. They thought it was significant that the letter did not say that the Wrights' own opinion would decide which machine was more suitable, but only that their judgment might decide the question. Because of their strong belief that the Smithsonian was showing a prejudiced attitude, they made no reply to the Walcott letter. There was no further correspondence on this subject between the Smithsonian and the Wrights until 6 years later. In 1916, the original Wright plane was exhibited at the dedication of the new buildings of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Alexander Graham Bell, a regent of the Smithsonian Institution, saw the plane and expressed astonishment. It was the first he knew that it was still in existence. Shortly afterward, in a conversation with Orville Wright, he asked why the plane was not being exhibited by the Smithsonian. "Because," replied Orville, "the Smithsonian does not want it." "Indeed, the Smithsonian does want it," exclaimed Dr. Bell. He was sincere in thinking so, and requested Dr. Walcott to get in touch with Orville Wright. Walcott, on December 23, 1916, wrote what Orville considered a perfunctory letter, saying, "The importance of securing for the National Museum the Wright aeroplane, which was exhibited at the opening of the new buildings of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, has been suggested to me." Orville Wright replied that he would be glad to take up the question with Dr. Walcott in a personal interview. A few days later the two met in Washington, but it was soon evident to Orville that Dr. Walcott's attitude had not changed, that he did not want the original Wright machine which had flown exhibited beside the Langley machine, which had failed to fly. When Orville found that Walcott's attitude had not changed in the 6 years since the former correspondence, he gave the question no further consideration. Meanwhile, in 1914, after the federal courts had upheld the Wright patents in the suits against Glenn H. Curtiss and others, and recognized the Wrights as pioneers in the practical art of flying with heavier-than-air machines, an astounding thing happened. A few days after the final court decision had been delivered, Lincoln Beechey, a Curtiss stockholder, telegraphed to Secretary Walcott of the Smithsonian asking permission to attempt a flight with the original Langley machine. That proposal was not accepted, but 2 months later, when Glenn H. Curtiss himself said he would like to test the Langley machine, his request was granted. The Smithsonian entered into a deal with Curtiss in which he was to receive a payment of $2,000, and was permitted to take the original Langley plane from the Smithsonian to his shop at Hammondsport, New York. There he made numerous vital changes in the machine, using knowledge of aerodynamics discovered by the Wrights, but never possessed by Langley. No information is available to indicate that the Smithsonian offered any objection to these alterations being made. The Smithsonian's official observer, in connection with the tests of the machine, was Dr. A. F. Zahm, who had been technical expert for Curtiss in the recent lawsuits, and was to serve again in that capacity in another suit soon to follow. No one officially representing any disinterested scientific body was present during the time the changes in the machine were made, nor during the time it was tested. It seems highly improbable that Dr. Walcott could have been so unintelligent or so uninformed as to not know about the recent decision of the U.S. Court of Appeals against Curtiss, and equally improbable that he could have been unaware of Zahm's relations with Curtiss as expert witness and advisor. One may well wonder, too, if Dr. Walcott could have failed to understand why Curtiss had recently become interested in testing the Langley plane. In hundreds of pages of direct testimony in the lawsuits, neither Curtiss nor Zahm had mentioned Langley's name, though they had more than once referred to Chanute, Maxim, Henson, Marriott, Bolton, Pilcher, Hart, and other pioneers. One may further wonder if Walcott could have been unaware when, in 1913, the Smithsonian awarded the Langley Medal to Curtiss, that he had already been pronounced an infringer of the Wright patents by a federal court, and that another decision in a higher court was pending. It almost looked as if there might have been an intent to try to influence that decision. Curtiss had a strong motive for wanting to make it appear that the Langley plane could have flown. The United States Court of Appeals had held that the Wrights were pioneers in the field of heavier-than-air flying machines, and that, therefore, their patent claims were entitled to a liberal interpretation. If Curtiss could demonstrate, or seem to demonstrate, that a machine capable of flight had been built before the Wright machine, then he could weaken their claims, to his financial advantage, in a patent suit he expected to have to defend. In consequence of the important changes that were made, Curtiss finally was able to make several short hops, of less than 5 seconds, with the reconstructed machine, in May and June 1914, over Lake Keuka, at Hammondsport, New York. Then the Smithsonian, in its annual report of the U.S. National Museum for that year, falsely stated that the original Langley plane had been flown without modification. And the annual report of the Smithsonian Institution for 1914, with equally glaring falsity, said, "It, the Langley machine, has demonstrated that with its original structure and power, it is capable of flying with a pilot and several hundred pounds of useful load. It is the first aeroplane in the history of the world of which this can truthfully be said." The institution's annual report for 1915 continued to repeat such untruths. The tests thus far made have shown that former Secretary Langley had succeeded in building the first airplane capable of sustained free flight with a man. Similar misstatements were made in the institution's reports for 1916, 1917, 1918, and afterward. Altogether, here had been something probably unique in scientific procedure. A test was made purporting to determine if the original Langley plane was capable of flight. But the test was not made with the machine as designed and built by Langley, nor with an exact copy of it. No disinterested official observer was present. Misstatements were published about the results, and no information was furnished regarding the changes made to enable anyone to learn the truth. To have made one more honest test of the Langley plane that had immediately crashed each time it was launched over the Potomac would have been permissible. But for a scientific institution officially to distort scientific facts, and in collaboration with a man who stood to gain financially by what he was doing, has been called worse than scandalous. After the Langley machine had been restored, as nearly as possible, to its original state, it was placed on exhibition by the Smithsonian. Soon afterward it bore a label that falsely proclaimed it to be the first man-carrying airplane in the history of the world capable of sustained free flight. But neither in connection with the exhibit of the Langley plane, nor in any report of the Smithsonian Institution, was there any hint of the fundamental changes made at Hammondsport, without which the plane could not possibly have carried its weight. One of these changes had to do with the supporting posts on the wings. Professor Langley had not known, indeed, no one knew until the Wrights' wind tunnel experiments established the facts, where the center of air pressure would be on a curved surface, and consequently he had failed to place his wing trussing posts where they were most needed. In the attempts to fly the machine over the Potomac in 1903, the wing that bore the greater part of the weight had each time collapsed at the moment the apparatus had left the starting platform. Lacking the knowledge about curved surfaces that later was available, those in charge of the 1903 trials had blamed the trouble on the launching apparatus. At the Hammondsport tests, the trussing posts were moved 30 inches rearward. This brought the guy posts almost exactly in the same plane with the center pressure on the wings, and thus eliminated the backward pull that had wrecked the machine in the 1903 tests. 3 fundamental changes were made in the design of the wings themselves. 1. The camber was greatly changed. 2. The shape of the leading edge was entirely different. 3. The aspect ratio, the ratio of span to chord, was increased. These 3 features are the most important characteristics in determining the efficiency of a wing. The change of the camber of itself may increase the efficiency of a wing by 30%. And not only were the wings changed as to design, but they were strengthened by various means of reinforcing and trussing not used by Langley. Even the cloth on the wings was improved by varnishing to make the wings more efficient. Langley had not used varnish on the cloth. Numerous changes were made in other parts of the machine. The large fixed vertical keel surface, situated below the main frame in 1903, was entirely omitted in 1914. This omission improved the machine's stability. A different kind of rudder was used. The position of the pennant tail, used by Langley, was raised about 10 inches to increase the stability of the machine, and was connected to a modern steering post to give better control. The forward corners of the original Langley propellers were cut off in the manner of the early Wright propellers to increase their efficiency. As the system of control Langley had used was not adequate, the aileron system, covered by Wright patents, a system unknown to Langley, was added. How did all these changes become known? Orville Wright called attention to them in an affidavit in 1915 in the Wright-Curtis lawsuit. One way to learn most of the facts is astonishingly simple. All that is necessary to any observer who knows what to look for is to make careful comparisons of the Smithsonian photographs of the original Langley machine with Smithsonian photographs of the machine tested at Hammondsport. It was learned, too, that even the engine used by Langley was changed in several respects. A modern type carburetor, a new intake manifold, a magneto ignition, and a modern radiator were installed. Though all these changes, and many others, were made in the machine at Hammondsport, the Smithsonian published only a few of them, the less important. It did not tell of the fundamental changes, and the institution made statements that, by implication, practically amounted to a denial that any changes of importance had been made. By omitting from its published reports at the time, and for many years afterward, the facts about the changes in the Langley machine, the Smithsonian Institution succeeded in deluding the public. If the stories about these fake tests had been issued by Curtis, who conducted them, or by an organization less well known than the Smithsonian, they might not have been taken seriously. But when false and misleading announcements were backed by the prestige of a famous scientific institution, it was possible to have the fraudulent character of the experiments pass generally unsuspected. When the reports of Secretary Walcott of the Smithsonian Institution said the original Langley machine had made flights, and when the report of the National Museum said the Langley machine had been flown without modification, such statements, untrue though they were, naturally carried weight. Indeed, the misstatements were so widely accepted as fact that they began to find their way into school textbooks and into encyclopedias. Griffith Brewer, the English aeronaut, delivered a lecture before the Royal Aeronautical Society in London in October 1921, and exposed the fraudulent nature of the Hammondsport tests. In this lecture he mentioned many of the vital changes made in the Langley plane before any attempt was made to fly it. Dr. Walcott made a statement in reply to Brewer. Up to this time, Orville Wright had thought that Walcott could have been ignorant of those changes. But after reading the Walcott statement, he was convinced that there was nothing accidental or unintentional about the misstatements published by the Smithsonian regarding the tests at Hammondsport. While the Kitty Hawk plane rested in its storage place, subject to possible fire hazards, officials of the Science Museum at South Kensington, London, England, had made requests to have the machine for exhibition there. After Orville Wright had become convinced that none of the members or regents of the Smithsonian Institution, or any other influential persons, were enough interested in establishing the facts in controversy to go to the trouble of making an investigation, he reluctantly decided, in 1923, to accede to the request from London. In reply to letters deploring this decision, he has expressed his reasons as follows. I believe my course in sending our Kitty Hawk machine to a foreign museum is the only way of correcting the history of the flying machine, which, by false and misleading statements, has been perverted by the Smithsonian Institution. In its campaign to discredit others in the flying art, the Smithsonian has issued scores of these false and misleading statements. They can be proved to be false and misleading from documents. But the people of today do not take the trouble to examine this evidence. With this machine in any American museum, the national pride would be satisfied. Nothing further would be done, and the Smithsonian would continue its propaganda. In a foreign museum, this machine will be a constant reminder of the reason of its being there. And after the people and petty jealousies of this day are gone, the historians of the future may examine impartially the evidence, and make history accord with it. Your regret that this old machine must leave our country can hardly be so great as my own. Reluctant to carry out his intention to send the Kitty Hawk plane out of the country, Orville Wright in 1925 proposed that the controversy be settled through the investigations of an impartial committee, but the suggestion got no response. He wrote a letter on May 14, 1925, to Chief Justice William Howard Taft, as Chancellor of the Smithsonian Institution, in the hope that it might yet be possible to have an impartial hearing. In this letter, after reviewing the relations of the Wrights and the Smithsonian, he said, "It was not until 1921 that I became convinced that the officials of the Smithsonian, at least Dr. Walcott, were fully acquainted with the character of the tests at Hammondsport. I had thought up to that time that they might have been ignorant of the fundamental changes which had been incorporated in the machine before these tests were made, and that when these changes were pointed out to them, they would hasten to correct their erroneous reports. They did not do this, but have continued to repeat their early statements. By these, the public has been led to think that flights were made in 1914 with the original Langley machine, with no changes excepting such as were necessary to attach floats for the new system of launching. When the proofs on both sides concerning these changes are shown, I do not think it will take you 5 minutes to make up your mind whether the changes were made and whether they were of importance. It seems to me possible that you, as Chancellor of the Smithsonian Institution, may wish me to present personally to you my evidence on these points, and to have Dr. Walcott present at the same time to give his proofs to the contrary. It may be a way of cutting short a long and bitter controversy. Chief Justice Taft replied that his position as Chancellor and head of the Smithsonian was purely nominal, that his other duties were such that he did not have the time to give any real attention to questions that have to be settled by the institution's secretary. A similar preference to stand aside was shown by others nominally in a position to exercise authority over the acts of the Smithsonian. That institution has as its members the President of the United States, the Vice President, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and members of the President's Cabinet. Its Board of Regents is made up of the Chief Justice, the Vice President, 3 members of the Senate, 3 members of the House of Representatives, and 6 citizens appointed by joint resolution of Congress. Any one of these members of the Board of Regents could doubtless have forced an investigation of any reported injustice committed by the Smithsonian. But all had other duties to occupy their time, and, like Chief Justice Taft, they were willing to let the Secretary of the Smithsonian act as he saw fit. Thus, the Secretary of the Smithsonian, which administers several important government bureaus besides the National Museum, could exercise great influence. That is how it came about that the attempt to mislead the public regarding the epochal achievements of the Wrights went so long unchecked by official action. And, as Orville Wright once said he had discovered, silent truth cannot withstand error aided by continued propaganda. After the exchange of letters with Chief Justice Taft, Orville Wright still delayed sending the Kitty Hawk plane to England. There was nothing impetuous about what he did. Not until early in 1928, or 14 years after the fraudulent tests at Hammondsport, with the Smithsonian still showing no intention to correct its false record of those flights, did he send the machine to the Science Museum at South Kensington. The arrangement he made with the Science Museum was that the plane should stay there for not less than 5 years, and permanently, unless brought back to the United States within his lifetime. Early in 1928, a bill was introduced in Congress to ascertain which was the first heavier-than-air flying machine. Shortly afterward, the Smithsonian adopted a resolution declaring that to the Wrights belongs the credit of making the first successful flight with a power-propelled heavier-than-air machine carrying a man. That resolution was, of course, superfluous, for there had never been any question, even by the Smithsonian, as to the first machine to make a sustained flight. But the Smithsonian continued to claim for Professor Langley credit for the invention of the first machine capable of flight. Dr. Charles G. Abbott became the secretary and director of the Smithsonian Institution in 1928, succeeding Dr. Walcott, who had died in 1927. Soon after he became head of the institution, Dr. Abbott invited Orville Wright to go to lunch with him at the Carlton Hotel in Washington. In the course of their talk, Dr. Abbott expressed the wish that they might come to an agreement by which the Kitty Hawk plane could be returned to America and placed under the care of the Smithsonian in the National Museum. Orville Wright said that this could easily be done. All that he asked for, he said, was a correction in the Smithsonian publications of the false and misleading statements previously made in those publications. Dr. Abbott expressed a willingness to do so, provided this could be accomplished without injuring the reputation of his predecessor or the prestige of the institution. But the painful fact was that the Smithsonian, however spotless its previous reputation, had committed a reprehensible act, and its reputation and prestige were bound to suffer when its guilt became known. Having committed a serious offense, one or other of 2 courses were open to it. 1, to confess its guilt and make a full, frank correction, or 2, to try to keep the misdeed concealed. Unfortunately, the institution adopted at the beginning the latter course, evidently in the belief that its great prestige, acquired through an honorable past, could crush any imputation against it. Indeed, that course did prove successful up to the time Orville Wright sent the Kitty Hawk plane abroad. Dr. Abbott had not been responsible for the disgraceful situation he inherited when he became secretary of the Smithsonian and found himself in the unenviable position of having to make an embarrassing decision. But it seemed as if he could not quite muster the courage to break away from the course the institution had been following. Instead, he tried at first to justify the institution's previous attitude, though he did concede that it was not true that the Langley plane had been flown at Hammondsport without modification, as the Smithsonian had published. There were many differences, he admitted. Some of the changes were favorable, some unfavorable to success, he declared. Just what effects, favorable or unfavorable, the sum total of these changes produced can never be precisely known. Orville Wright, on the other hand, insisted that the effects, favorable or unfavorable, could easily be determined by experts if only the changes were made known to them. But Dr. Abbott still failed to publish the changes. Since then, Orville Wright more than once let the Smithsonian know what he thought should be done to settle the controversy. In a letter he sent to Dr. Abbott on December 23, 1933, he wrote, "The points involved in the straightening of the record are not on matters of mere opinion. They are on matters of fact, which can at this time be easily and definitely established. All that I have demanded in the past has been that there be an impartial investigation of the matters in controversy, and that the record then be made to agree with the facts. The suggestion made by me in 1925, 3 years before the plane left this country, that a committee be appointed to make an impartial investigation and settle the controversy, received from the Smithsonian no response. Nevertheless, I shall be most happy now to join with you in the selection of such a committee, with the understanding that the committee will fully investigate the matters in controversy and will make a full report of its findings." In a letter a few weeks later, Dr. Abbott suggested that, if it were agreeable to Orville Wright, he would ask 3 public officials, each to name an expert, to serve on an impartial committee of 3 to investigate and report on the experiments at Hammondsport in 1914, and their bearing on the capacity of the Langley machine for flight in 1903. But all 3 of the government officials that he mentioned were members of the Smithsonian. If the suggested plan had been followed, presumably Dr. Abbott himself would have had the naming of the investigating committee, for in organizations such as the Smithsonian, appointing of committees by members is usually referred to the secretary. Chief Justice Taft, Chancellor of the Smithsonian, had written that because he did not have the time, he let questions regarding the institution be settled by the secretary. It appeared to Orville Wright that Dr. Abbott did not have too much confidence in the findings of a committee, even if wholly supported by the Smithsonian, for Abbott specified just what questions the committee was to investigate, and most of these were wholly irrelevant. A little later, Orville Wright, in a reply to a letter from Dr. Abbott, made this suggestion: that the Smithsonian publish a paper presenting a list of specification in parallel columns of those features of the Langley machine in 1903 and of the Hammondsport machine of 1914 in which there were differences, along with an introduction stating that the Smithsonian now finds it was misled by the Zahm report of 1914, that through the Zahm report the institution was led to believe that the airplane tested at Hammondsport was as nearly as possible in its original condition, that as a result of this misinformation, the Smithsonian had published erroneous statements from time to time, alleging that the original Langley machine, without modification, or with only such modifications as were necessary for the addition of floats, had been successfully flown at Hammondsport in 1914, that it asked its readers to disregard all of its former statements and expressions of opinion regarding the flights at Hammondsport in 1914, because these were based upon misinformation, as the accompanying list of changes would show. The accuracy of the list of changes was to be settled before publication by the Smithsonian, Orville Wright, and a mediator. But the suggestion was not followed. It will be noted that Orville Wright did not even ask that the Smithsonian should say it did not believe the original Langley machine could fly. All he asked was that the facts regarding the Hammondsport trials be made public by the Smithsonian. It has been his contention that if this information had not been withheld, then anyone having a knowledge of the science of aviation could form for himself an opinion regarding the importance of the differences between the original Langley machine of 1903 and the Zahm-Curtis Langley machine of 1914. He has been willing to stake his and his brother's reputation on the conclusion that a committee of competent, disinterested scientists would reach if they had all the facts. Dr. Abbott, in the years 1933 to 1942, proposed a number of times to issue a statement by the Smithsonian for the declared purpose of correcting the record. All these statements, however, except the final one, would have left the record as confusing as it was before. The first statement proposed was to contain 1. A history of Langley's work up to December 1903, which was entirely irrelevant to the controversy and would have filled hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of print. 2. A history of the Langley machine from 1903 to 1914, which, likewise, had no part in the controversy. 3. A. F. Zahm's report of the tests of the Langley machine at Hammondsport in 1914, with no correction by the institution of its many misrepresentations of facts about those tests. 4. Orville Wright's list of changes made in the Langley machine at Hammondsport in 1914, without any acknowledgment by the Smithsonian of its accuracy. The accuracy of the list was later acknowledged by the institution. 5. A long list of amendments by A. F. Zahm to Orville Wright's list of changes. These amendments, or comments, had the appearance of being corrections of errors in Orville Wright's list, though a careful reading will disclose that they were not corrections. Dr. Abbott's proposed statement thus would have dealt almost entirely with matters not involved in the controversy. About all that did touch on questions in the controversy would have been contradictory statements by Zahm and Wright. The reader, having no way of knowing which one was telling the truth, would have been more confused than ever. End of section 19. Section 20 of The Wright Brothers by Fred Kelly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Why the Wright Plane Was Exiled, Part 2. All the publications proposed later, except the final one, were similar to the first, though less voluminous. None of them would have clarified the situation any more than the first. Not until September 1942 did Dr. Abbott submit a statement which, with some amendments, was satisfactory to Orville Wright. That statement, published by the Smithsonian on October 24, 1942, is given here verbatim, as follows. The 1914 Tests of the Langley Aerodrome by C. G. Abbott, Secretary, Smithsonian Institution. Note: this paper has been submitted to Dr. Orville Wright, and under date of October 8, 1942, he states that the paper, as now prepared, will be acceptable to him if given adequate publication. It is everywhere acknowledged that the Wright brothers were the first to make sustained flights in a heavier-than-air machine at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, on December 17, 1903. Mainly because of the acts and statements of former officers of the Smithsonian Institution, arising from tests made with the reconditioned Langley plane of 1903 at Hammondsport, New York, in 1914, Dr. Orville Wright feels that the institution adopted an unfair and injurious attitude. He therefore sent the original Wright Kitty Hawk plane to England in 1928. The nature of the acts and statements referred to are as follows. In March 1914, Secretary Walcott contracted with Glenn H. Curtis to attempt a flight with the Langley machine. This action seems ill-considered and open to criticism, for in January 1914, the United States Court of Appeals, Second Circuit, had handed down a decision recognizing the Wrights as pioneers in the practical art of flying with heavier-than-air machines, and pronouncing Glenn H. Curtis an infringer of their patent. Hence, in view of probable further litigation, the Wrights stood to lose in fame and revenue, and Curtis stood to gain pecuniarily, should the experiments at Hammondsport indicate that Langley's plane was capable of sustained flight in 1903, previous to the successful flights made December 17, 1903, by the Wrights at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The machine was shipped to Curtiss at Hammondsport, New York in April. Dr. Zahm, the recorder of the Langley Aerodynamical Laboratory, an expert witness for Curtiss in the patent litigation, was at Hammondsport as official representative of the Smithsonian Institution during the time the machine was being reconstructed and tested. In the reconstruction, the machine was changed from what it was in 1903 in a number of particulars, as given in Dr. Wright's list of differences, which appears later in this paper. On the 28th of May and the 2nd of June, 1914, attempts to fly were made. After acquiring speed by running on hydroplane floats on the surface of Lake Keuka, the machine lifted into the air several different times. The longest time off the water with the Langley motor was approximately 5 seconds. Dr. Zahm stated that it was apparent that owing to the great weight which had been given to the structure by adding the floats, it was necessary to increase the propeller thrust. So no further attempts were made to fly with the Langley 52 horsepower engine. It is to be regretted that the institution published statements repeatedly to the effect that these experiments of 1914 demonstrated that Langley's plane of 1903, without essential modification, was the first heavier-than-air machine capable of maintaining sustained human flight. As first exhibited in the United States National Museum, January 15, 1918, the restored Langley plane of 1903 bore the following label: The original full-size Langley flying machine, 1903. For this simple label, others were later substituted, containing the claim that Langley's machine was the first man-carrying aeroplane in the history of the world capable of sustained free flight. Though the matter of the label is not now an issue, it seems only fair to the institution to say that in September 1928, Secretary Abbott finally caused the label of the Langley machine to be changed, to read simply as follows: Langley Aerodrome, the original Samuel Pierpont Langley flying machine of 1903, restored. Deposited by the Smithsonian Institution, 301,613. This change has frequently been overlooked by writers on the controversy. In January 1942, Mr. Fred C. Kelly of Peninsula, Ohio, communicated to me a list of differences between the Langley plane as tested in 1914 and as tested in 1903, which he had received from Dr. Wright. This list is given verbatim below. The institution accepts Dr. Wright's statement as correct in point of facts. Inferences from the comparisons are primarily the province of interested experts and are not discussed here. Comparison of the Langley machine of 1903 with the Hammondsport machine of May-June 1914. Langley 1903, Hammondsport 1914. Wings. 1. Size. Langley 11 feet 6 inches by 22 feet 6 inches. LM, page 206. Hammondsport 10 feet 11 3/4 inches by 22 feet 6 inches. The letters LM in the first column refer to Langley Memoir. 2. Area. Langley 10,040 square feet. LM, page 206. Hammondsport 988 square feet. 3. Aspect ratio. Langley 1.96. Hammondsport 2.05. 4. Camber. Langley 1 to 12. LM, page 205. Hammondsport 1 to 18. 5. Leading edge. Langley wire 1/16 of an inch diameter. LM, page 166. Hammondsport cylindrical spar 1 1/2 inch diameter at inner end, tapering to 1 inch diameter at outer end. 6. Covering. Langley cotton fabric not varnished. Hammondsport cotton fabric varnished. 7. Center spar. Langley cylindrical wooden spar measuring 1 1/2 inches diameter for half its length and tapering to 1 inch at its tip. LM, page 204. Located on upper side of wing. Hammondsport cylindrical spar about 1 1/2 inch diameter at inner end, tapering to about 1 inch diameter at outer end. Located on upper side of wing. This center spar was reinforced by an extra wooden member on the underside of the wing, which measured 1 inch by 1 1/2 inch, and extended to the 7th rib from the center of the machine, and by another wooden reinforcement on the underside, extending out about 1/4 of the length of the wing. 8. Ribs. Langley, hollow box construction. LM, plates 66, 67. Hammondsport. Most of the original Langley box ribs were replaced with others made at Hammondsport. Manley Letter, 1914. The Hammondsport ribs were solid construction and made of laminated wood. That part of the rib in front of the forward spar was entirely omitted. 9. Lower guy posts. Langley. A single round wooden post for each pair of wings, 1 1/4 inch in diameter, 6 1/2 inches long. LM Plate 62, page 184. Hammondsport. 4 for each pair of wings, 2 of which were streamline form measuring 1 1/4 inches by 3 1/2 inches by 54 inches long, and 2 measuring 2 by 2 inches with rounded corners, 3 feet 9 inches long. 10. Langley. The front wing guy post was located 28 1/2 inches in front of the main center spar. LM Plate 53. Hammondsport. The front wing guy posts were located directly underneath the main center spar, 28 1/2 inches further rearward than in 1903. 11. Langley. The rear wing guy post was located 31 1/2 inches in front of the main center spar. LM Plate 53. Hammondsport. The rear wing guy posts were located directly under the main center spar, 31 1/2 inches further rearward than in 1903. 12. Upper guy posts. Langley. For each pair of wings, a single steel tube, 1/4 inch diameter, 43 inches long. LM, page 184, PL 62. Hammondsport. For each pair of wings, 2 streamline wooden posts, each 1 1/4 inches by 3 1/2 inches, 76 inches long, forming an inverted V. 13. Langley. Front wing upper guy post located 28 1/2 inches in front of the main center spar. LM, PL 53. Hammondsport. Front wing upper guy post located directly over main spar, 28 1/2 inches further rearward than in 1903. 14. Langley. The rear wing upper guy post was located 31 1/2 inches in front of the main center spar. LM, PL 53. Hammondsport. The rear wing guy posts were located directly over the main center spar, 31 1/2 inches further rearward than in 1903. 15. Trussing. Langley. The wing trussing wires were attached to the spars at the 5th, 7th, and 9th ribs out from the center. LM, PL 54. The angles between these wires and the spars to which they were attached are shown in Figure 3. Hammondsport. A different system of wing trussing was used, and the wing trussing wires were attached to the spars at the 3rd, 6th, and 9th ribs from the center. The angles between these wires and the spars to which they were attached were all different from those in the original Langley machine. Control surfaces. 16. Langley. Vane rudder. A split vane composed of 2 surfaces united at their leading edges and separated 15 inches at their trailing edges, thus forming a wedge. Each surface measured 2 feet 3 inches by 4 feet 6 inches, with aspect ratio 0.5. LM, page 214, PLS 5354. Hammondsport. Vertical rudder. The Langley vane rudder was replaced by a single-plane vertical rudder, which measured 3 feet 6 inches by 5 feet, with an aspect ratio of 0.7. 17. Langley. Operated by means of a wheel located slightly in front of the pilot at his right side and at the height of his shoulder. LM, page 216, PLS 5354. Hammondsport. Operated at Hammondsport through the Curtis steering wheel in some tests, Zom affidavit, pages 5, 6, through the Curtis shoulder yoke in some others, Manley Letter, 1914, and fixed so as to not be operable at all in still others, Zom affidavit, page 7. 18. Used for steering only. LM, page 214. Hammond's port. Used as a vertical aileron to control the lateral poise of the machine. Zom affidavit, page 6, as well as for steering. Zom affidavit, page 7. 19. Langley. Pinot tail. This was a dart-shaped tail having a vertical and a horizontal surface, Pinot tail, each measuring 95 square feet. It was located in the rear of the main frame. Hammond's port. Tail rudder. Same size and construction as in 1903. 20. Langley. Attached to a bracket extending below the main frame. Hammond's port. Attached to same bracket at a point about 8 inches higher than in 1903. 21. Langley. Normally inactive, LM page 216, but adjustable about a transverse horizontal axis by means of a self-locking wheel, located at the right side of the pilot, even with his back, and at the height of his shoulder. LM PLS 51-53. Hammond's port. Operable about a transverse horizontal axis and connected to a regular Curtiss elevator control post directly in front of the pilot. Zom affidavit, page 5. 22. Langley. Immovable about a vertical axis. LM, page 214, PL 56, figure 1. No means were provided for adjusting this rudder about a vertical axis in flight. Although it was necessary that the large aerodrome should be capable of being steered in a horizontal direction, it was felt to be unwise to give the Pinot tail and rudder motion in the horizontal plane in order to attain this end. LM, page 214. Hammond's port. Immovable about a vertical axis on May 28, 1914 only. Thereafter it was made movable about a vertical axis and was connected through cables to a Curtiss steering wheel, mounted on a Curtiss control post directly in front of the pilot. 23. Keel. Langley. A fixed vertical surface underneath the main frame, measuring 3 feet 2 inches in height by 6 inches average length. Area 19 square feet. LM PL 53. Hammond's port. Entirely omitted. System of control. 24. Lateral stability. Langley. The dihedral only was used for maintaining lateral balance. LM page 45. Hammond's port. 3 means were used for securing lateral balance at Hammond's port. The dihedral angle as used by Langley, a rudder which serves as a vertical aileron, Zom, affidavit page 6, and the Pinot tail rudder. The last 2 constituted a system identical in principle with that of complainants, Wright, combined warping of the wings and the use of the vertical rudder. Zom affidavit page 6. 25. Longitudinal stability. Langley. Langley relied upon the Pinot system of inherent stability for maintaining the longitudinal equilibrium. For the preservation of the equilibrium, longitudinal, of the aerodrome, though the aviator might assist by such slight movements as he was able to make in the limited space of the aviator's car, the main reliance was upon the Pinot tail. LM, page 215. Hammond's port. At Hammond's port, the Pinot inherent longitudinal stability was supplemented with an elevator system of control. 26. Steering. Langley. Steering in the horizontal plane was done entirely by the split-vane steering rudder, located underneath the main frame. LM, page 214. Hammond's port. On one day, May 28, 1914, steering in the horizontal plane was done with the vertical rudder which had been substituted for the original Langley split-vane steering rudder. After May 28th, the steering was done by the vertical surface of the tail rudder. Zom affidavit, page 7, which in 1903 was immovable about a vertical axis. LM, page 214. Power plant. 27. Motor. Langley. Langley 5-cylinder radial. Hammond's port. Langley motor modified. 28. Ignition. Langley. Jump spark with dry cell batteries. LM, page 262. Hammond's port. Jump spark with magneto. 29. Carburetor. Langley. Balzer carburetor consisting of a chamber filled with lumps of porous cellular wood saturated with gasoline. The air was drawn through this wood. There was no float feed. LM, page 225. Hammondsport. Automobile type with float feed. 30. Radiator. Langley. Tubes with radiating fins. Hammondsport. Automobile radiator of honeycomb type. 31. Propellers. Langley. Langley propellers. LM, PL 53, pages 178 to 182. Hammondsport. Langley propellers modified after fashion of early Wright blades. Launching and floats. 32. Launching. Langley. Catapult mounted on a houseboat. Hammondsport. Hydroplanes developed 1909 to 1914 attached to the machine. 33. Floats. Langley. 5 cylindrical tin floats with conical ends attached to the underside of main frame at appropriate points and about 6 feet above lowest part of machine. Hammondsport. 2 wooden hydroplane floats, mounted beneath and about 6 feet to either side of the center of the machine at the lateral extremities of the Pratt system of trussing used for bracing the wing spars of the forward wings, and 1, part of the time 2, tin cylindrical floats with conical ends, similar to but larger than the Langley floats, mounted at the center of the Pratt system of trussing used for bracing the rear wings. All of the floats were mounted from 4 to 5 feet lower than the floats of the original Langley, thus keeping the entire machine above the water. Weight. 34. Total weight. Langley. With pilot, 850 pounds. LM, page 256. Hammondsport. With pilot, 1,170 pounds. 35. Center gravity. Langley. 3/8 of an inch above line of thrust. Hammondsport. About 1 foot below line of thrust. Since I became secretary in 1928, I have made many efforts to compose the Smithsonian Wright controversy, which I inherited. I will now, speaking for the Smithsonian Institution, make the following statement in an attempt to correct, as far as now possible, acts and assertions of former Smithsonian officials that may have been misleading or are held to be detrimental to the Wrights. 1. I sincerely regret that the institution employed to make tests of 1914 an agent who had been an unsuccessful defendant in patent litigation brought against him by the Wrights. 2. I sincerely regret that statements were repeatedly made by officers of the institution that the Langley machine was flown in 1914 with certain changes of the machine necessary to use pontoons, without mentioning the other changes included in Dr. Wright's list. 3. I point out that Assistant Secretary Rathbun was misinformed when he stated that the Langley machine without modification made successful flights. 4. I sincerely regret the public statement made by officers of the institution that the tests of 1914 showed that the late Secretary Langley had succeeded in building the first aeroplane capable of sustained free flight with a man. 5. Leaving to experts to formulate the conclusions arising from the 1914 tests as a whole, in view of all the facts, I repeat in substance, but with amendments, what I have already published in the Smithsonian Scientific Series, Volume 12, 1932, page 227. The flights of the Langley Aerodrome at Hammondsport in 1914, having been made long after flying had become a common art, and with changes of the machine indicated by Dr. Wright's comparison, as given above, did not warrant the statements published by the Smithsonian Institution that these tests proved that the large Langley machine of 1903 was capable of sustained flight carrying a man. 6. If the publication of this paper should clear the way for Dr. Wright to bring back to America the Kitty Hawk machine to which all the world awards first place, it will be a source of profound and enduring gratification to his countrymen everywhere. Should he decide to deposit the plane in the United States National Museum, it would be given the highest place of honor, which is its due. Publication of this statement in the Smithsonian Annual Report presumably should mark the end of the long controversy. End of Section 20. End of the Wright Brothers by Fred Kelly.